The mind behind the weapon, the MAS-49, and the engineers who dragged France into the semi-auto age. The winter morning of 1946 hung grey and bitter over the workshops of Saint-Étienne. Inside the testing range, a lone engineer named Paul Reberol pressed his cheek against the stock of a rifle that didn't yet have a name, only a designation, MAS-44. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Around him, military observers stood with arms crossed, skepticism carved into their faces like scars. The rifle barked once, clean ejection, smooth chambering, 8 rounds downrange without hesitation. The observers said nothing. One officer turned and walked away before the demonstration even finished. In that silence, Reberol understood a truth that would haunt him for years. His country did not want to be saved from itself. The smell of gun oil hung in the air, mixing with the metallic bite of spent brass. Reberol lowered the rifle slowly, feeling its weight. Not just the physical steel and wood, but the accumulated burden of 5 years' work, 2 rejected prototypes, and countless nights bent over drafting tables while his marriage dissolved in the darkness beyond his workshop door. France emerged from World War II carrying more than defeat. It carried humiliation. The Blitzkrieg of 1940 had revealed a devastating truth. While German soldiers advanced with rapid-fire weapons and modern doctrine, French infantrymen still operated bolt-action rifles designed at the turn of the century. The MAS-36, reliable as winter frost, required a soldier to manually cycle every single shot while enemy machine guns painted the fields with lead. It wasn't just a technological gap, it was philosophical. By 1946, as Reberol stood in that cold testing range, the strategic crisis had only deepened. France's colonial empire was fracturing. Indochina simmered toward open warfare. Reports from Hanoi and Saigon spoke of sudden jungle ambushes where bolt-action rifles became death sentences, French soldiers breaking their firing positions to work bolts, while Viet Minh guerrillas disappeared into green shadows, their semi-automatic weapons having already spoken their final words. The High Command, however, remained unmoved. Steeped in the doctrine of tir de précision, they resisted. Accuracy over volume, discipline over firepower. The cult of the sharpshooter remained sacred, even as the world burned. "So, Reberol," one officer had said the previous week, leaning against a workshop table, "you want to turn our soldiers into Americans, spraying bullets like cowboys?" "I want them to survive the first 30 seconds of contact," Reberol had answered quietly. The officer had smiled without warmth, then trained them to shoot better the first time. Now, standing in the aftermath of a perfect demonstration that had convinced no one, Reberol carefully set the MAS-44 on the workbench. His reflection appeared ghostly in the workshop window. A man 10 years older than his 42 years, thinning hair grey at the temples, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labour, but from fighting institutional gravity. Outside, snow began to fall over Saint-Étienne. The city had built rifles since Napoleon's time. Its workshops had armed the Grande Armée, survived the Franco-Prussian War, produced millions of weapons for the trenches of 1914. The weight of that history pressed down on every conversation, every design review, every budget meeting. Reberol's assistant, a young machinist named Georges Dupont, approached with a thermos of coffee. "They didn't even stay for the accuracy trials," Georges said softly. "They'd already decided before we fired the first shot. Then why do we continue?" Reberol took the coffee, letting its warmth seep into his cold hands. Through the window, he could see the testing range where fresh snow was already covering the spent brass casings, small golden artifacts of a demonstration that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Because in 6 months, Georges, maybe a year, a soldier is going to die in Indochina. He's going to work his bolt, chamber his next round, and in that half-second, someone faster is going to kill him. And when that happens enough times, when enough mothers receive telegrams, when enough coffins come home, they'll remember this morning. They'll remember we had an answer. Georges was silent for a moment. That's a cold comfort. It's the only comfort we have. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the sounds of Saint-Étienne's industrial heart. Somewhere in the workshops below, lathes turned and hammers rang against steel. France was rebuilding, reshaping itself from the ruins of occupation and defeat. But some things, Reberol was learning, rebuild slower than others. Some things resist change with the weight of centuries. He picked up the MAS-49 again, feeling its balance, the smooth action of its gas system, the careful geometry that had taken him years to perfect. It was just steel and wood. But it was also a question posed to a nation that didn't want to hear it. How many soldiers have to die before doctrine admits it was wrong? If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments and stay with us for the next chapters. Paul Reberol had grown up in the shadow of the Great War. His father, Michel Reberol, returned from Verdun in 1917 with shrapnel still embedded in his spine and a cough that never quite left his lungs. The elder Reberol had been a metal worker at the Saint-Étienne arsenal before the war, and he returned to the same lathe, the same workshop, the same rhythms of industrial production that had armed France since the Revolution. Young Paul learned early that weapons were not instruments of glory, but mechanical problems waiting for solutions. At 15, he could disassemble any rifle manufactured in France. At 17, he understood their limitations better than most officers twice his age. He saw how the Lebel, magnificent for its time, had become obsolete. He watched his father wince with pain while adjusting tolerances on MAS-36 receivers and heard the old man's bitter observation. We build them strong. We build them accurate. But we build them slow. The humiliation came in 1936. Reberol, by then, a junior engineer at the Manufacture d'Armes, proposed modifications to improve rate of fire on standard infantry rifles. His supervisor, a traditionalist named Bertrand, who had survived the Marne, dismissed him with a phrase that would echo for a decade. France doesn't need cowboys, Reberol. We need soldiers who can shoot straight. 4 years later, those soldiers who shot straight were either dead, captured, or fleeing south as panzers rolled through the Ardennes unopposed. Reberol spent the occupation years in hiding, sketching designs on scraps of paper, calculating gas pressures and bolt velocities by candlelight in his sister's apartment in Lyon. His colleagues thought him obsessed. Perhaps he was. But obsession, he learned, was the only appropriate response to national catastrophe. The strategic mathematics were inescapable. In the forests and rice paddies of Indochina, French forces faced an enemy who understood that modern warfare was won not by marksmanship contests, but by volume of fire. Viet Minh units, equipped with captured Japanese semi-automatics and aging but functional Soviet weapons, could deliver sustained fire that pinned French units in place, allowing flanking maneuvers and ambushes that turned textbook defensive positions into killing grounds. Field reports arrived weekly at Saint-Étienne, each one a litany of the same bitter refrain: we need more firepower, we need it now. Yet the doctrinal resistance remained impenetrable. The generals who had survived the war, many trained in the peacetime army of the 1920s, saw semi-automatic rifles as wasteful, inaccurate, prone to jamming. They cited the American M1 Garand's weight. They referenced Soviet rifles' complexity. They invoked l'esprit français, the uniquely French approach to warfare that valued precision and economy of ammunition. When Reberol pointed out that precision meant nothing if you died before getting a second shot, Colonel Moreau, head of small arms procurement, had replied with devastating simplicity, "Then train them to shoot better the first time." The personal cost accumulated slowly, like rust. Reberol's marriage to Claire, already strained by the war years, finally dissolved in the spring of 1947. She had tried to understand, tried to accept the 16-hour days and the emotional exhaustion, but there were limits. "You love that rifle more than you love me," she had said quietly one evening, standing in the doorway of their apartment while he hunched over blueprints at the kitchen table. He had looked up, seen the defeat in her eyes, and known she was right. Not because he loved her less, but because the rifle had become more than metal and mechanics. It had become an obligation to soldiers who were dying in jungles he would never see, facing enemies he would never fight, because doctrine valued tradition over survival. "I'm sorry," was all he could say. She had left before sunrise. He discovered her absence only when the morning light revealed the empty closet, the absent photographs, the silence where her breathing should have been. At night, he dreamed of Saint-Étienne's factory floors filling with water, drowning unfinished prototypes, while he stood paralyzed, unable to save them. His hands developed a permanent tremor, not from fear, but from the accumulated stress of knowing that every day of delay meant another soldier might die with an obsolete weapon in his hands. His colleague, Georges Dupont, watched him waste away, and wondered if one man's conviction could genuinely change a nation, or if conviction was simply another word for madness. "You're killing yourself," Georges said one evening, finding Reberol in the workshop long after midnight, adjusting gas system tolerances by the light of a single lamp. "Better me than them," Reberol answered, not looking up from his work. The MAS-44 prototype sat on the bench between them, its metal cold in the winter air. Outside, Saint-Étienne slept. Inside, Paul Reberol kept his vigil, one adjustment at a time, one calculation at a time, one sleepless night at a time, driven by a certainty that felt increasingly like madness, that he was right, that the weapon would work, that eventually, inevitably, reality would force doctrine to admit its mistakes. The only question was how many soldiers would die before that happened. The breakthrough that wasn't came in the winter of 1947. After months of refinement, Reberol arranged another formal demonstration of the MAS-44 for procurement officials. This time, he brought data, comparative fire rate calculations, reliability statistics from civilian hunting rifles using similar gas systems, ammunition economy projections that showed semi-automatic fire actually conserved rounds by increasing first-shot effectiveness. The demonstration itself was flawless. The rifle cycled smoothly through 200 rounds without malfunction. Accuracy at 300 meters exceeded MAS-36 standards. Recovery between shots was minimal. The weapon's weight fell within acceptable parameters for infantry use. Colonel Moreau watched without expression. When the firing concluded, he consulted briefly with his colleagues, then approached Reberol with a clipboard. "Impressive," he admitted, "but irrelevant." "Sir? We lack the industrial capacity for mass production of semi-automatic weapons. We lack the ammunition production to supply them. We lack the training infrastructure to retrain the entire army. And most importantly, Monsieur Reberol, we lack the budget. France is bankrupt. We're rebuilding roads, bridges, factories. The army gets what remains, and what remains barely covers replacement MAS-36 for units in Indochina." Moreau's voice wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was genuinely sympathetic. "Your rifle works, I don't deny that. But working and affordable are different problems. Come back when we have money we don't have, and factories we haven't rebuilt. Until then, focus on improving our existing designs." Reberol stood in the empty testing range long after the officials departed, holding the MAS-44, feeling its useless perfection. He had solved the mechanical problem, but mechanical problems were easy. The real obstacle was institutional inertia, multiplied by economic devastation, reinforced by doctrinal pride. That night, he received a letter from Indochina. Not official correspondence, a personal note from a lieutenant named Marchand, whom Reberol had known before the war. Marchand wrote in careful, controlled sentences about a firefight near Cao Bang, about how his platoon had engaged Viet Minh forces at dawn, about how French rifles fired, worked bolts, fired again, while the enemy delivered continuous suppressive fire that pinned them for 6 hours. "We held," Marchand wrote, "but we held because they withdrew, not because we won. Every man in my platoon understands we were lucky. Luck isn't doctrine. Luck isn't sustainable. And Paul, I'm afraid our luck is running out." The letter concluded, "I don't know what you can do. I don't know if anyone can do anything. But if there's a way to give us weapons that match what we're facing, please find it. We're soldiers. We'll fight with what we have. But we shouldn't have to die because someone in Paris thinks accuracy is more important than staying alive." Ribeyrolles read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer, next to rejection letters from procurement, budget estimates that never added up, and Claire's final note saying she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. The next morning he began redesigning the gas system from scratch. Georges found him at noon, surrounded by discarded calculations. The procurement board said no, Georges observed carefully. They said the weapon works, but France can't afford it. "Then we make it cheaper," Ribeyrolles answered, not looking up. "Simpler manufacturing tolerances, fewer precision components. We use stamped parts where we can, forgings where we must. We design for field maintenance, not armory perfection. That'll take months, maybe a year. Then we start now." But the real problem, Ribeyrolles was beginning to understand, wasn't technical or economic. It was psychological. France's military establishment had been humiliated in 1940, occupied for 4 years, forced to rebuild from nothing. Admitting that their doctrine was wrong, that their sacred tir de précision couldn't match modern battlefield realities, that admission required a kind of honesty that institutions rarely possess. They would change only when forced, and force would come only from undeniable evidence. In May 1948, that evidence arrived in the form of an after-action report from Cao Bang. A French garrison had faced a sustained Viet Minh assault. The defenders, equipped with MAS-36 rifles, held for 6 hours before ammunition ran critically low. Post-battle analysis revealed a horrifying statistic. Each French soldier had fired, on average, 43 rounds. Each Viet Minh fighter had fired over 200. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable. France was sending its soldiers into battles they couldn't win, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked firepower. Ribeyrolles saw his opening. He bypassed the generals and approached the Ministry of Defense directly with a proposal. Field trials of an improved design, now designated MAS-49, under combat conditions, 100 rifles, 60 days. If they failed, the project would die permanently. The ministry, desperate for solutions in an expanding colonial crisis, agreed. "Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history." The first 50 MAS-49 prototypes shipped to Indochina in August 1948. Ribeyrolles didn't sleep the night before their departure, standing in the arsenal watching crates being loaded onto transport trucks that would carry them to Marseille, then to ships bound for Saigon. Each rifle represented hundreds of hours of refinement, simplified gas systems, improved tolerances, lighter components that maintained durability. Georges stood beside him in the pre-dawn darkness. "What if they fail?" he asked quietly. "Then soldiers die. And I spend the rest of my life knowing I could have done better. And if they work?" Ribeyrolles was silent for a long moment. "Then soldiers live, and the generals have to admit they were wrong. I don't know which outcome they'll resist harder." The rifles reached operational units in September. Lieutenant Marchand's company received 15. The first reports came back positive. The weapons cycled reliably with French-manufactured 7.5 54mm ammunition, and soldiers adapted quickly to the semi-automatic fire. But relief was premature. The first failure occurred 3 weeks into field trials. A rifle seized mid-combat during a patrol engagement near Hanoi. The malfunction report was technical and damning. The gas system, optimized for factory-fresh French ammunition, malfunctioned spectacularly when fed captured Japanese rounds or improvised reloads, common in colonial warfare. Reberol's detractors circled immediately. Colonel Moreau, vindicated in his skepticism, recommended the program's immediate cancellation at the monthly procurement meeting. "You see," Moreau said, sliding the malfunction report across the conference table. "Perfect on the test range, useless in the real world. This is why we maintain proven designs, gentlemen. Novelty fails when soldiers' lives depend on it." But the story didn't end there. A young armorer named Henri Faure, stationed with a mechanized unit in Hanoi, had noticed the pattern. Rifles that fired only French-manufactured ammunition worked flawlessly. Rifles that fired mixed-source ammunition seized. The problem wasn't the weapon's fundamental design, it was sensitivity to ammunition variations that test ranges never encountered. Faure, working without authorization in a makeshift workshop behind the unit motor pool, made a field modification. A simple adjustment to the gas regulator that allowed the rifle to function across a wider pressure range. He installed the modification on his unit's 3 MAS-49s, then reported the results through unofficial channels. When word reached Saint-Étienne, Reberol wept at his workbench. "A corporal," he whispered to Georges, "a corporal in a mud-covered workshop found the solution we missed. So we implement his modification immediately. And we admit in the next design review that the weapon was incomplete, that we needed field experience to perfect it. That admission nearly killed the program." At the October procurement meeting, Colonel Moreau seized the opportunity. "So your revolutionary rifle needed emergency modifications in the field to function properly. This is exactly why we resist untested innovations. You shipped incomplete weapons to soldiers facing combat. Men could have died because you were in a hurry to prove your theories." Reberol met his gaze steadily. "Men were already dying, Colonel. Every day. With rifles that fired one shot for every 5 the enemy delivered. Yes, the MAS-49 needed refinement. Every weapon does. But while we refined it, soldiers survived firefights they wouldn't have survived with MAS-36s. The after-action reports prove it. After-action reports prove soldiers liked having more firepower. That's not the same as proving the weapon is sustainable for mass production and long-term service. Then let us prove that. Extend the trials. Let us implement Faure's modification and demonstrate. No, Moreau's voice was final. This program has consumed enough resources. The rifles in Indochina will complete their 60-day evaluation, then return for decommissioning. This meeting is adjourned. Reberol sat in the empty conference room long after the others departed. Through the windows, he could see Saint-Étienne's workshops, smoke rising from forged chimneys, the city that had armed France for generations. He had come so close. The weapon worked, soldiers validated it. But institutional resistance, multiplied by one engineer's pride, had stopped him. That evening, he composed a letter to the Minister of Defense. He didn't expect a response, but he wrote it anyway, laying out the statistics, the combat reports, the modification that had saved the program, the soldiers' testimony. He wrote it because giving up felt like betraying Marchand, Faure, and every soldier who had trusted that someone in France was fighting for them. 3 weeks later, the minister's office requested his presence in Paris. The Minister of Defense, Pierre Bilotte, received Reberol in a Paris office that overlooked the Seine. It was November 1948, and early winter light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across maps of Indochina spread on the conference table. Bilotte was not a military man by training. He was a politician, navigating the impossible mathematics of rebuilding France, while fighting colonial wars the nation could barely afford. He studied Reberol with the exhausted pragmatism of someone who had heard too many promises and seen too few solutions. "Your rifle," Bilotte said without preamble. "Colonel Moreau tells me it's expensive, unreliable, and solves a problem that doesn't exist. Your letter tells me the opposite. Which of you is lying?" "Neither, sir," Reberol answered carefully. The colonel is correct that the MAS-49 costs more than our current rifles and requires different manufacturing infrastructure. But he's wrong that the problem doesn't exist. Soldiers are dying in Indochina because they can't match enemy firepower. That's not opinion. That's mathematics. Everything is mathematics, Monsieur Ribeyrol. I have mathematicians who tell me France can't afford this war at all. Why should I spend money we don't have on weapons the army doesn't want? Ribeyrol opened his leather case and withdrew a folder of field reports from Lieutenant Marchand, Corporal Faure, and a dozen other soldiers. Battle after battle, where MAS-49 equipped units survived engagements that should have destroyed them. Because the alternative, sir, is explaining to mothers why their sons died with weapons designed for the last war. Bilot read in silence. When he looked up, his expression had changed, not to acceptance, but to something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, of a problem he couldn't afford to ignore. "I'll authorize continuation of field trials," he said finally. 6 more months. "But understand this clearly. If your rifle fails, if it proves unreliable or impossible to manufacture at scale, I will personally ensure that Saint-Étienne never wastes another franc on semi-automatic fantasies. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, sir." "And Monsieur Ribeyrol?" Bilot's voice softened slightly. "I hope you're right. For all our sakes." The breakthrough came not from engineering or bureaucracy, but from journalism. In January 1949, a photographer named Robert Capa, embedded with French forces in Indochina, published a photo essay in Paris Match titled Les Armes de Demain, Weapons of Tomorrow. The centerpiece image showed a French corporal, face streaked with mud and exhaustion, clutching a MAS-49 after repelling a dawn assault near Hanoi. The rifle's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable against the smoke and morning light. The accompanying article, written by a combat correspondent named Lucien Baudard, told the story directly. French soldiers were fighting with outdated weapons, while a solution sat in bureaucratic limbo because doctrine valued tradition over survival. Baudard quoted Lieutenant Marchand extensively, "Let soldiers speak about what they needed versus what they were given," and ended with a devastating question: how many more must die before Paris admits the war has changed? Public pressure mounted overnight. Questions arose in the National Assembly. Opposition politicians demanded explanations. Why were French soldiers still dying with obsolete weapons when a solution existed? Why had procurement rejected a rifle that combat troops validated? What exactly was more important than soldiers' lives? Budget concerns or generals' pride? Colonel Moreau attempted to contain the damage with technical arguments about manufacturing capacity, ammunition logistics, training requirements. But technical arguments collapsed against photographs of exhausted soldiers holding rifles that worked, accompanied by letters from the front saying, "This weapon saved my life." In March 1949, facing political embarrassment that threatened his ministry, Bilot authorized expanded production of the modified MAS-49. Not full adoption yet. That would require formal doctrine changes the generals still resisted, but enough rifles to equip multiple battalions in Indochina for comprehensive evaluation. The manufacturing expansion began immediately. Saint-Étienne's workshops retooled production lines, trained machinists on the new tolerances, established quality control procedures for gas systems that could handle variable ammunition. Ribeyrol worked 18-hour days, coordinating the transition, sleeping in his office, surviving on coffee, and the knowledge that every rifle leaving the arsenal might save a soldier's life. By June 1949, 800 MAS-49s were in service. By December, over 2,000. The reports continued arriving: higher rates of fire, improved survival in ambush situations, enthusiastic adoption by infantry units who understood that doctrine might value tradition, but soldiers valued staying alive. In February 1950, facing undeniable evidence and continued political pressure, the French army authorized full-scale production of the MAS-49 as standard infantry issue. The transition that France's military establishment had resisted for 15 years occurred in 18 months, not because doctrine changed, but because reality left no alternative. The first mass-production rifles shipped to Indochina in April 1950. Ribeyrolles stood in the arsenal watching the crates depart, Georges beside him. "You did it," Georges said quietly. "No," Ribeyrolles answered, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Marchand did it. Faure did it. Baudard did it. The soldiers who refused to die quietly did it. I just refused to stop believing them." The MAS-49 became the backbone of French infantry operations in Algeria, Suez, and every colonial conflict of the 1950s. Its reliability in desert conditions, its adaptability to various combat scenarios, proved Ribeyrolles' original vision correct. The rifle served faithfully until the 1980s, eventually evolving into the shortened MAS-49-56. Tens of thousands were manufactured. Hundreds of thousands of French soldiers carried them into battle, but vindication carried unexpected weight. In 1952, Ribeyrolles attended a ceremony at the Ministry of Defense where several engineers received recognition for contributions to France's post-war recovery. His name wasn't mentioned. Colonel Moreau, now retired, gave a speech about the importance of maintaining French military traditions while adapting to modern requirements, as if the MAS-49 had emerged naturally from institutional wisdom rather than despite institutional resistance. Afterward, Lieutenant Marchand, now Captain Marchand, decorated for service in Indochina, found Ribeyrolles outside the building. "They didn't even say your name," Marchand said, anger visible in his posture. "They don't have to," Ribeyrolles answered quietly. "The soldiers know. That's enough." But it wasn't quite true. The absence of recognition bothered him less than the rewriting of history. The careful narrative that France's army had thoughtfully modernized its infantry weapons through prudent evaluation and measured adoption, erasing the years of resistance, the soldiers who died waiting for change, the careers sacrificed fighting institutional inertia. The true impact, however, was doctrinal. The MAS-49 forced the French army to finally abandon the cult of bolt-action precision and accept that modern infantry tactics required sustained fire. The weapon proved that doctrine must bend to battlefield reality, not the reverse, a lesson that military institutions perpetually resist until casualties make resistance impossible. Ribeyrolles retired from Saint-Étienne in 1956, his health broken by 15 years of obsessive work, sleepless nights, and the accumulated stress of fighting battles that shouldn't have needed fighting. His hands still tremored. His marriage had never recovered. But the rifle worked, and soldiers lived who might have died, a accounting that offered cold comfort but comfort nonetheless. He never gave public speeches, never claimed credit, never sought recognition. When a military historian interviewed him in 1967 for a book on French small arms development, Ribeyrolles spoke mainly about the technical challenges, the manufacturing process, the contributions of colleagues like Faure and Georges. He mentioned the institutional resistance only briefly, without bitterness, as if describing weather patterns rather than deliberate obstruction. "Did it frustrate you," the historian asked, "that they fought your design so long?" Ribeyrolles considered the question carefully. "Frustration is personal. This was never personal. It was just reality meeting doctrine. Reality always wins eventually. I was simply stubborn enough to wait. But men died waiting. Yes, men died. That's the part that matters." He died in 1973, the same year France officially retired the last MAS-36 rifles from active service. The newspapers didn't notice. By then, the MAS-49 itself was being replaced by the FAMAS and the 5.56mm Revolution. Progress, as always, devouring its parents. The rifle hangs now in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, encased in glass, its metal cold and silent. Visitors walk past without pausing, eyes drawn to flashier displays, Napoleonic sabers, World War I artillery, resistance weapons. Few notice the small placard, noting that this particular rifle represented France's reluctant acceptance that the 20th century required different solutions than the 19th. Fewer still remember Paul Reberol's name, but in the archives at Saint-Étienne, in the letters preserved from soldiers who served in Indochina and Algeria, in the maintenance logs of rifles that served for 30 years without fundamental redesign, the evidence remains. One engineer saw what needed to exist and refused to accept that institutional pride mattered more than soldiers' lives. He didn't change France because he wanted to. He changed it because reality demanded it, and he was stubborn enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to document that reality until denial became impossible. The weapon didn't change warfare. The men who refused to accept preventable deaths did. The MAS-49 was simply the instrument of their conviction, cold steel and gas-operated mechanics bearing witness to a simple truth, that the greatest battles aren't fought on battlefields, but in procurement offices and design reviews, where courage means saying clearly and repeatedly that yesterday's solutions won't suffice for tomorrow's wars. In the end, it wasn't the rifle that endured. It was the quiet certainty that somewhere always, someone must be stubborn enough to fight for what soldiers need rather than what institutions want, even if that fight costs everything, earns nothing, and ends in a silence that history rarely bothers to remember. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.